Hello everyone, welcome to our latest Taylor Wessing webinar on the practical steps you need to take to support your workforce through Brexit. My name is Charlie Pring from Taylor Wessing's immigration team. I was due to be joined by my colleague Vicky Weiberg today, but she's unexpectedly unwell. But the good news is I'm joined instead by Lucy Moore from our team. Lucy's going to jump in with any questions as people put them through. So please do, as we go through this webinar, submit your questions through the Q&A box. And at the end, if you have the time to complete the survey, please do submit that, and we'll take into account your comments for next time. So the purpose today is to talk about how you can help your European employees that are in the UK with Brexit. Obviously, there's ongoing Brexit uncertainty. Probably chaos is the better word. There are more votes in Parliament tonight about various options. At the moment, there is no deal. There is no agreed terms on the UK's departure from the EU. We're slowly moving towards that, or moving towards some resolution, but as we stand, exit date is the 29th of March, but the likelihood is, following the votes tonight, there will be a request to try and push that back. This webinar deals with the current legal position, which is an exit date of the 29th of March, but please do bear in mind that may change in the coming days, in which case that sort of trigger date will get pushed back. And the purpose of today's session is to give you some information about the EU settlement scheme. That's the scheme that the government is introducing to help European workers to protect their status after Brexit, and how you as a business can help to support your staff. So we're going to look at an overview of the Brexit timeline and the scheme itself, this new registration or application scheme for European citizens and their family members to apply. We're going to look at when people should apply, how they practically can submit their applications, what conditions there are on applying, and what evidence they get of approval, and then perhaps most importantly, how you as employers can help to support your employees through this process. We've been doing a lot of work with businesses in the UK that have been through that process of providing information, reassurance, support in various different ways. And I think the feedback we've had is that the businesses that have proactively started to do that have benefited from some real goodwill and an appreciation from their employees. We'll also look at how Brexit impacts on both sort of business travel and new hires travelling in or moving into the UK after Brexit, and finally looking longer term what the immigration landscape will look like from 2021, when there'll be a completely new immigration system that will apply equally to European and non-European citizens. So a quick recap on the timeline. I think everybody knows the basics, which is that the 2-year fixed period under Article 50 is due to end on the 29th of March, but may well be extended because of votes going through Parliament actually tonight. But at the moment, as things stand, it will be the 29th of March, and as things stand, there is no agreed deal. And unless something happens, either to extend or to reach a deal before that date, then there would be a departure on the 29th of March without a deal. Now, from the 21st of January, there has been, the EU settlement scheme has been open for European citizens to apply. It is a voluntary testing phase, so before January it was only open to a small category of applicants while they tested it, and now it is still in the testing phase, but it's open to everybody. So people can apply now if they choose to, but they don't have to. As you'll see in the top row actually the deadline for applications to the EU settlement scheme will be the end of next year, so 31 December 2020, if there is no deal. And if there is an agreed deal, then applicants get another 6 months, so they don't have to apply until 30th of June 2021. So the good news is, firstly, that people don't need to apply immediately before Brexit. This is not an urgent step that people have to do in the next couple of weeks. Having said that, my advice is always to people apply as soon as you can, because it's a good thing to get it settled and sorted out, so there's no confusion over status. And secondly, the other sort of headline point in terms of reassurance for employees is that it's the same process whether there's deal or no deal. So although we have some uncertainty about the final outcome, as far as your employees in the UK are concerned who need to apply, they go through the same process however we end up with Brexit. And actually that's an advantage for you as a business, because it means that if you want to, and you haven't already, you can start rolling out practical support to your employees now, because you can be as sure as one can be that they'll have to do the same thing whatever happens with Brexit, albeit that the Brexit date might be pushed back. And then finally, as I mentioned before, from the 1st of January 2021, the UK will have a completely new immigration system. And that means that European citizens that are arriving fresh, so for example, if you hire workers from Europe into the UK from 2021, unless they have some family route or other personal route, they're probably going to need a work permit, but we'll come on to that a bit later. So what do you need to know? The first thing is that all of your European employees in the UK are going to have to take action to protect their status. So up until this point, we've had free movement of European workers, so any European citizens are able just to arrive in the UK to work, to live, to study without needing any visa or immigration permission. But the UK's departure from the EU changes that and means that people must proactively protect their status by making an application. And that application is through what's called the EU settlement scheme. That's an online process, but just to reiterate, the application does not need to be done before Brexit, whether that's this month or later. There is a long period in which people can apply. It's the same scheme available whether there's deal or no deal, although applicant rights are watered down slightly if there is no deal in relation to family reunion and the deadline for applications we talked about. The big news that's come out in the last couple of months is that the application now has no government fee, so it's free for everybody to apply. When it was announced, it was going to be a £65 application fee for adults and half that, £32.50 for children, but now that's been waived for everybody. There is a practical point, which is that announcement on the fee waiver was made on the same day that the scheme went live on a voluntary basis on the 21st of January. And so that means that until they manage to change the tech at the end of March, applicants will have to pay now if they're applying for settled status or pre-settled status, but they will be refunded in due course. Now, one thing we're asked as lawyers is, well, what happens if there's no deal? Does that mean that employees, European citizens, will suddenly be in the UK unlawfully and not allowed to work on the day after Brexit date? No, that's not the case. They will have the legal right to continue to live and work in the UK. They will have to take action under the EU settlement scheme to apply for this new status. But their rights to be in the UK and to continue to work will not be impacted. What is the EU settlement scheme? Well, because the automatic right of European citizens and their families to be in the UK will end with Brexit, there needs to be a mechanism by which people can apply to protect their status. and importantly, it's a way to for those European citizens to show that they have a different status than, for example, those people that might arrive from 2021, who won't be eligible for this, but they will have a different sort of visa permission. The scheme will generate two different types of status. The first is called settled status. That's permanent residency, so it's an indefinite right to stay and live in the UK. If the applicant has been living in the UK continuously for 5 years. And it's all about residence, not about what activities the individual has been doing. So they don't need 5 years employment with your business. It could be 5 years employment with your business and a mixture of other companies. Or it could be a mixture of employment and non-employment, so study or childcare or whatever other activity the individual is doing. It doesn't need to be employment, and unlike the current rules for Europeans, where if you wanted to get permanent residency, you had to show that while you were studying, if you had a period of study during your 5 years, that you had private medical insurance, that scheme has now been removed. The alternative status for those that haven't been in the UK for 5 years at the point they apply is called pre-settled status. That's a temporary 5-year permission, and it is a path towards settled status. So you, for example, somebody that's been in the UK for 2 years already, they would apply for pre-settled status to give them another 5 years, and then when they reach 5 years in total, so in 3 years' time, they could then apply for settled status, and that would then give them permanent stay and the rights to continue to live, study and work in the UK, and to claim continued access to healthcare and public benefits. So any European citizen with a biometric passport or a non-European citizen that has a biometric card because their status is linked to a European citizen through marriage or a partnership, then they can apply from the 21st of January. There's one small change to that, which is that actually the app or the online scheme is only available to EU citizens until the 21st of January. So for citizens that are from the extra, what we call European Economic Area countries, that's Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and also Switzerland, which is not in the EEA but is treated as if it is, they will have to wait until the scheme goes fully operational from the 30th of March. But otherwise, EU citizens can apply now, or they can apply later, up until the end of 2020 if there's no deal, or mid-2021 if there is a deal.
Hi, Charlie. So just kicking off the first question, we've got a question from Swelha who's asking what happens to British citizens in Netherlands and France post-Brexit?
So the answer to that question, thank you for that, it depends on whether there's a deal or there's no deal. So if there is a deal, then the withdrawal agreement that sets out a transition period until 2020 will apply, and British citizens in any EU country will be able to apply for pre-settled status or settled status in the same way. It's not exactly the same scheme, it's not the same online technology, but it is the same principle. They'll get the same legal rights and the same ability to preserve their status. If there is no deal, then the position is more complicated, because if there's no deal, there is no transition period, there is no agreed departure terms between the EU and the UK, and so each European country will impose its own rules for British citizens that are in their country. So each country will have a different scheme, and those European countries at the moment, generally speaking, have committed to protecting the rights of British citizens, but there are differing stages as to where they've got to with their with the implementation of those schemes. So in some countries there's an application to a local sort of registry, and in others they're still working through the Parliament. So I think for British citizens, it's keep an eye on the news coming out of their Parliament, and obviously on whether or not there is eventually a deal. But it's unfortunately a little less certain for British citizens in Europe than it is for European citizens here, where we know there's a fixed process, however things end up. Okay, so moving on. Who is eligible to apply to the EU settlement scheme? Well, it's any citizen of the EU 27 countries, and then also through trade arrangements, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. Anybody whose status, UK immigration status, depends on a European citizen to be in the UK. So if you have what's called an EEA family permit, or if your employee has a residence card, then they would need to apply as well. Now, when we say it's open to all citizens of the EU 27, it's actually optional for Irish citizens to apply because of common travel area arrangements that predate the EU, and so those special arrangements between the UK and Ireland will continue. My advice to Irish citizens is, because it's free and because, as we'll see in a minute, it's very straightforward to apply, I would still apply in case third parties like banks and employers and landlords start to ask for status. But that is optional for Irish citizens. In fact, non-Irish family members of Irish citizens do still need to apply if they're relying on the Irish citizens' European status, but the Irish citizens themselves won't need to. Until the 9th of April, applications can only be made through the online technology inside the UK, but after that date, most people would be able to apply from, or some people will be able to apply from outside the UK as well.
I'm just going to jump in again there, Charlie. We've got a question from Elizabeth, and she's asking, what does an EU national have to do if they already have indefinite leave to remain?
And she says that she's thinking about somebody who's from Romania. So indefinite leave to remain is effectively permanent residency. It's the same label as settled status, but it has a different name because it's the old scheme. And it means the right to stay indefinitely in the UK. If somebody's already been through that permanent residence application, they will have spent a lot of time and effort preparing that and getting that status. But unless they have gone one step further and applied for British citizenship, anybody with permanent residency must still apply under this scheme. So applicants that already have permanent residence aren't exempt from having to apply. They'll still have to do it. It should be straightforward. It will be even easier than people that don't have permanent residence. It should be a straightforward conversion, but it still does need action in the same deadlines that we talked about earlier. So how does somebody make an application under the EU settlement scheme? Well, the scheme is completely digital, so it's all online. So as an immigration lawyer, I'm used to very paper-heavy, difficult to understand, long application forms with lots of mailed supporting documents. This is a different scheme. It's all online. Most people won't need to mail any documents at all. They will submit an online application. If there are any supporting documents they need to provide, those can be uploaded digitally. The scheme has more of a presumption of approval, with the Home Office looking to help applicants rather than under the scheme we've had for many years, which is more like the applicant has to prove their status, prove everything about themselves and their residence. This is about the government trying to help you, or to help the applicant, I should say, to prove their residence. And the way they do that is through automated checks with other government agencies. So mainly that's through the tax status. So if somebody is working in the UK, then through their national insurance number, the Home Office will verify their residence through checks with HMRC, the tax authorities. They won't need to provide any other supporting documents to take a simple case of somebody with 5 years of employment. There will be a right of appeal for refusals if there is a deal. So that would mean the right to go to a court and say, the Home Office made the wrong decision. If there's no deal, then it's a slightly different review process. It's called an administrative review, which is basically asking the Home Office to take another look at the decision because you think they got it wrong. It's not the same as going to a court and having a judge make a decision on it. There's really a 3-stage test for applications. The first is verifying identity, and that's done online, and we'll have a quick look at that in a minute. The eligibility point is really about residence. So it's about living in the UK, either for less than 5 years or more than 5 years. It's not about what the applicant has been doing during that time. As long as they're living in the UK, then they're potentially eligible. And then finally, there's a suitability check, which is a criminality check about sort of criminal records.
So we've had a couple of questions come in on that slide, Charlie. The first from Matilda. She's asking, do EU citizens have an automatic right for pre-settled status post-Brexit, or will there be conditions as there are to apply for visas currently?
So, as I said, it's fairly light, or it's very light actually on conditions. So, but compared to other immigration routes, it doesn't have many conditions. So there's no assessment of what an applicant has been doing. There's no requirement that they're employed. There's no requirement that they're doing any type of particular job or paid. There's no requirement that they're employed at all. So it's there to be deliberately open to everybody without an assessment really of what someone has been doing. The main reasons that people would have a potential issue with an application, so a potential refusal, although we'll come on to see that refusals haven't been happening yet, is if someone's had a lot of absence from the UK during their last 5 years, in which case they might not be able to apply for settled status, but they could apply for pre-settled status if they're back in the UK by Brexit date.
And the second question is from Matilda, and she's asking, if someone is the spouse of an EU national and they are a Nigerian national, what do they have to do?
So it depends on when they arrive. If they arrive before Brexit, then they would apply firstly for what's called an EEA family permit, so a 6-month visa that allows them to come to the UK, and then during that 6 months they would apply for a longer-term status, potentially through the EU settlement scheme. After Brexit, then it would be the same type of application. I think it's going to be labelled something else, but as long as the relationship existed before Brexit, then it should be a straightforward application to join their European spouse in the UK. So let's move on to how to apply. There is an app which is called the EU Exit ID Document Check app. It's a snappily titled app which is where applicants have to go to verify their identity when they want to apply. Now, the bad news is this app is only available on Android devices. You can't get it on an Apple device because the government don't have permission from Apple to use the scanning technology. The way you get around that is that it doesn't have to be the applicant's own device. You can borrow, beg or steal a device from somebody else who has it and who has the app installed. But the key thing is that the device has what's called near-field communication, or NFC. That's basic scanning technology. Any phone that you can pay contactless will have NFC on it, and all of the modern devices do. And what will happen is the applicant will scan their biometric passport or residence card if they're a non-European whose status relies on somebody else, and that scans the chip to verify ID, and then you or the applicant takes a selfie for a facial image through the app to verify that the individual is who they say they are. And that then leads to a series of online questions about the applicant, not too detailed, and it shouldn't take most people more than about 30 minutes to complete the app. We've done it for colleagues and for clients, and it's a fairly straightforward process. Those people that don't have continuous employment, in other words, don't have a continuous tax record, may need to upload some supporting documents digitally to prove their residence. So again, you don't have to mail anything, but it might need uploading of maybe council tax bills or evidence of attendance at university to prove where there's a gap where it's not obvious. For example, where there's not employment, there might be a need to upload documents. Molly has asked if we're making an offer of employment to someone from the EU and they'll be joining us after Brexit, would it be sensible to reference the EU settlement scheme in their employment contract? Well, the question is depends on whether there's a deal or no deal. If there's a deal, it will be straightforward to employ them any time up until the end of 2020. If there is no deal, then we'll come on a bit later to look at, there's a completely different picture for those people that are arriving after Brexit. And that actually those applicants, those employees won't be able to use the EU settlement scheme. So I'm not sure that you need to make reference to the EU settlement scheme. You might want to say to applicants that the business will support them in every way that they can with Brexit, but because it depends on all sorts of various permutations about the timing of Brexit and whether there's a deal or no deal, I'm not sure you can be any more specific than that. So we'll move on to this is the app, the EU Exit ID Document Check app. This is what people will see in Google Play when they search for the app. It has the government crown on it. That's just to give you a sense that it's a fairly straightforward process. You can see it's quite a user-friendly app. It gives quite straightforward instructions with images and pictures. And I think most people that have done it have found that actually it's a refreshingly straightforward process to go through. And there's a couple of screenshots here, again, just about the app and what it looks like. We've been quite impressed with how it's worked, with fast decisions. And as I say, most people shouldn't need to spend about 30 minutes or more than to actually file their application. So we've been on we've had a testing phase open from about November. It started with a small pool. It's gradually got larger, and it's now open to everybody from the 21st of March. And actually, there's some encouraging statistics that have just been published about how things are going so far with the testing. So there's been about 150,000 applications made up until sort of the beginning of this month. It's been open to everybody since the 21st of January. Now, not everybody has had a decision, so there are a few, there are some pending cases, we think. But as at a couple of weeks ago, there were no refusals at all, and 84% of applicants didn't need to provide any extra evidence. So their residence was verified through their tax record or through some other government agency check. 90% of people were able to provide their ID through an app rather than having to send it in. A few people will have to mail in a passport if, for example, they can't get access to an app, or if they haven't got a biometric passport or residence card. Decisions are coming through incredibly quickly, actually. Again, as an immigration lawyer, I'm used to things taking months and months to get decided, particularly for European applications. But 81% of applications have been decided within a week, and 75% within 3 days. Lucy did one about a week ago where for a colleague, and actually we got the decision within an hour or so of submission. So they are coming through very quickly, unusually quickly for the Home Office, and that's because of the automated nature of some of the checking. On the right-hand side, you can see a couple of the negatives. Obviously, the big one is that you can't apply through an Apple device. There are some older Android devices that don't have near-field communication, but they're I think quite few and far between. And there is occasionally some issues with the scanning. Usually, if there is a problem with the scanning, if the applicant comes back again and tries again another time, it usually will fix. Worst case, they can mail in their documents to the Home Office, and the Home Office will send them straight back once they've verified ID. So somebody asked a question earlier about conditions. This is just to reiterate really the ease of application. Really, it's a residence test rather than any sort of assessment of activity or employment. Somebody else asked about whether if somebody already has permanent residence or indefinite leave to remain, will they still have to apply? Yes, they will, but it will be a fairly straightforward conversion process. So one area which is always worth looking at, particularly if you've got frequent travellers or employees that are going on work assignments in and out of the UK, there is a requirement that for applicants for settled status, they do need continuous residence over the 5-year period. And that means that they should be living in the UK for at least 6 months in each 12-month period, which runs backwards from whenever they apply for settled status. But there is also one extra period of up to 12 months allowed during the 5 years, if that's for what the government would call a good reason. So something like a serious illness, pregnancy, childbirth, a study assignment overseas, or a work assignment at another office. So one period of up to 12 months shouldn't break the continuous residence. Minor criminal convictions won't make any impact on approval either, so sort of traffic offences. Really, it's very serious criminal convictions that lead to imprisonment or persistent offenders. They're the category of people that might have a problem with refusals, but as you'll see from the 150,000 so far, not one person yet has been refused. They've all received either settled status or pre-settled status. The one flag with applicants is that if somebody is a dual British and European citizen, they can't apply. They don't need to apply because they have a British passport already, but the app won't let them apply because they'll be asked about their British citizenship. So what happens when the decision is issued? Well, the approval will actually all be online. The applicant will receive an email confirming the decision, and they'll be then given access to a portal where they can view their status online and then share that with third parties that might need to know. And that will be particularly important in the future as we get it towards 2021, when individuals will need to be able to demonstrate their status to new employers, to banks, to landlords, to the NHS. One flag is that if employees are applying now for pre-settled status, because they're not at 5 years yet, they will need to diarise to apply again for settled status, if they're still in the UK, once they hit the 5 years in total. We don't expect that there'll be any sort of reminder from the government that they're hitting that mark. So some people may have to make a second application. but it will be straightforward, it will be free, so it's just a case of making sure that they do that later on. Now, one important factor, again, when you're thinking about work assignments for employees and moving people between offices, is that once an employee has settled status, they will only lose it if they relocate away from the UK for more than 5 years. So settled status allows you to live in the UK indefinitely, and it will only be cancelled after 5 years or more absence from the UK. And that's quite helpful for example, planning work assignments. Once someone's got settled status, they can go to another one of your international offices for a couple of years, and then have the unrestricted right to return under their settled status without having to qualify under the much more restrictive immigration system that will be in place from 2021. So when we've been out with our employer clients, helping them with planning for Brexit and supporting their workforce, what sort of things have employees said to us that they're concerned about and they care about? Obviously the impact on their status and their family status, particularly if there's no deal, which inevitably causes more confusion and uncertainty. When and how to apply, the practicality of actually doing that, the conditions that we've talked about, what happens with absences, if people have been out of the UK for a period of time, what's the position with their family members, with children, with current children and future children, and there are different rules. Basically, if you have pre-settled status and then your children will be able to apply for the same status as you. Once one parent has settled status, the child can have that as well, even if they've not been in the UK for 5 years. And if an individual, a European citizen, has a child born in the UK after that person has settled status, the child will be automatically British. So there's some quite helpful rules around protecting family members as well. One thing we're asked quite a lot is about British citizenship, which is completely optional for people, and whether they should apply for that. There's various factors. It's a completely different application. Generally speaking, unless an applicant is married to a British citizen, they have to wait 12 months after having settled status before they apply for British citizenship. But it is completely optional. The main sort of practical or legal benefit to British citizenship is that if an individual plans to leave the UK for more than 5 years and wants the ability to return to the UK without having to qualify under the new immigration system, if they have a British passport, obviously they can do that, but they would need to check that their current European country allows dual citizenship, because not all do. How does Brexit impact on planning for the future around things like work assignments, around family, and what will it mean in terms of returning back to the UK, and also how will it impact on travel, the basic sort of vacation or business travel? How will that impact on things?
So we've just had a question from Matilda, who's asking, can you apply via a website and scan your ID rather than using the app?
So the basic principle is you need to use the app, because websites or a PC or an online site doesn't have the scanning technology. It's the scanning of the biometric chip in either the passport or the residence card that's the important piece to verify ID. So for people that don't have access to an Android phone, they can either mail their documents to the Home Office so that they can verify, or there's about 20 or so centres around the UK that are approved where somebody can turn up to an appointment and the scan can be done there. So there's a couple of alternatives for people that don't have access to an iPhone, but it won't be possible just to do that on a website. You can answer the questions on the website, but you won't be able to get to them first because you've got to verify ID before you get to the questions. Okay, good. We'll move on. So, how can you, as a business, support your workforce? Well, there's really three categories of workers that you'll have in the UK that this would be relevant for. So, obviously, European or Swiss citizens, citizens of any nationality, and that would include British colleagues that have European family members who, and your employee is concerned about the impact of Brexit on their family, and also any non-European citizens that you have in the UK whose UK immigration status is based on a relationship with a European citizen. And so I think there's various things that we've been doing with companies to help to reassure and support their staff. And I think it's always important to think about making sure that that support is consistent with your business culture, how you communicate with staff, how you interact with staff, what works best for them, your size, and practically how many people are impacted by this, whether you have different locations and how in the UK, and whether how you practically support different people at different locations. But there are various ways in which an employer can provide that help. It can be provision of information, so that might be through materials, FAQs, written advice for employees. It could be through a group presentation, a staff presentation, where you or your lawyers could talk about the impact of Brexit and the practicalities of what they need to do, like we've been talking about today. Where we've done it, we've found that one-to-one advice clinics or surgeries work very well with employees. So you'd have a series of pre-arranged appointments, perhaps 30 minutes each, 25 minutes, whatever, where employees can talk about their personal situation and what they need to do, and any concerns that they have. And practical help can also extend to submitting the actual online applications through the app and through the online questions. Generally speaking, people don't need lawyers to submit their application, but it can be a helpful resource, and we've arranged it with clients so that we're on hand to help people, in a set period of time when we arrive at their office to help them with applications if they feel that would be helpful. We talked a bit earlier about British citizens in Europe. The issue there, as I said, is that no-deal planning is a bit more complicated. So basically, British citizens need tailored advice because each country will implement its own domestic immigration rules if there is no deal. What about how does Brexit impact on those that are visiting or relocating to the UK after the planned Brexit date of the 29th of March, but before the end of 2020? Well, that really depends on what happens with the deal. So if there's a deal, it's quite straightforward. Nothing really changes until the end of 2020. And actually, European citizens can come to the UK and work, as they always have, until that date. And anyone arriving before the end of next year can get long-term status through the EU settlement scheme, like people that are already in the UK. If there's no deal, it is a more restrictive position, as you'd expect. There won't be a transition period. Business travel should still work, although there may well be some more queues at the airports. For people that are moving to the UK and that don't have a sort of family route, they can come to the UK for 3 months if there's a no deal. But during that period, they must apply for a new status, which is called European Temporary Leave to Remain, or ETLR. And ETLR is a fixed 3-year visa, effectively, that can't be extended or renewed. It does not lead to permanent stay or settled status. It doesn't allow the individual to apply to the EU settlement scheme. And so to stay beyond that 3-year fixed period, they'd have to qualify under the new rules, which will come in from January 2021. We don't know exactly what they'll look like. We'll come on in a minute just to talk about the sort of the general outline. But I think the point in the case of no deal for colleagues that you're moving into the UK, European colleagues that you're moving into the UK office, in the case of no deal after Brexit, is that for 3 years there is a route, but there is some uncertainty about what would happen beyond 3 years. Nobody can yet be sure, which makes it difficult to persuade employees to make the commitment to the UK where there isn't a guarantee of permanent stay. And what about the other way? So British citizens going to Europe between Brexit date and the end of 2020. Again, different treatment depending on whether there's a deal. Straightforward, if there's a deal, no problem at all. British citizens arriving before the end of 2020 will be able to secure their status long term. If there's no deal, then British citizens will certainly have probably longer queues when they're arriving in Europe. There is no transition period, so people moving to Europe for work assignments, for example, would need a work permit in the country they're going to. Travel shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's very much like the Schengen rules that are already there. But one practical point which has come out of discussions with the EU is that British citizens that are travelling to the EU in the case of no deal must have more than 6 months left on their passport, which hasn't been something that British citizens have really worried too much about before. So it's worth just circulating that message if we do get a no deal. And as we come to the end of this webinar, let's look a bit further into our crystal balls about hiring European workers from 2021, when we'll have this completely new immigration system. So up until the end of 2020, there's a sort of fixed period, deal or no deal, we know where we stand. The 2021, January 2021, there will be a new immigration regime. Obviously, there will be a large talent pool that's already in the UK that have been through the EU settlement scheme, and they have the long-term right to stay, so you'll have access to that talent. But the principle is that the preferential treatment for European citizens will end with Brexit. And so the new regime is going to be more like sponsored work visas for Europeans who are arriving from 2021 onwards, similar to what some of you will have been through with the Tier 2 system, so a sponsorship through the UK entity. There is going to be some relaxation of the rules for employers, so we expect that the minimum skill level for Tier 2 visas will be reduced from graduate level to also cover medium-skilled roles. There should be, hopefully, a removal of the need to do the resident labour market test or advertising, and there should also be a removal of the cap, which is currently in Tier 2 General. So there are some concessions for employers. There's going to be a consultation about what the minimum salary should be for skilled roles. There is talk about it being 30,000, but a lot of businesses are very concerned about how that would impact on their ability to hire. So there's going to be some discussion, and do get involved if you see the opportunity to feed back into government about that in the next year or so. There's also a proposal for a 12-month visa for temporary workers to perform lower skilled jobs, so it won't have a minimum skill level, and that is designed to be there as a sort of safety net for the lower skilled roles, or lower paid really is how the government would define it. I guess the question is how attractive that would be to people to come here for a year and then not have a route to stay longer term. The consequence of all of that will be, I think, that more smaller companies that at the moment have avoided Tier 2 sponsorship will get pulled into the sponsorship system. And inevitably that will mean a little more recruitment cost and a delay in hiring, more planning and longer lead-in time when you're recruiting when you get to 2021, because you won't have the instant ability to move people in from overseas or from international offices. So to wrap up, Brexit will not invalidate your workers' rights to be in the UK and to work for you, but they will have to take action to protect their rights, and that action is the same whether it's deal or no deal. If you haven't already, do give some thought to how you will provide support and reassurance to your European workforce in the UK. As we said at the start, we know the outline of the position, whether there's deal or no deal, which gives you the opportunity to go out to your European workers in the UK to give them that support. Granted, we do have ongoing uncertainty about the timing of Brexit and the exact way that it will end up looking, but I think that employers that are proactive in their support, even if they have to delay implementing the actual applications, if you've gone out and you've been supportive early on, then I think those companies that we've seen that have done that have got a real benefit from their employees for doing that. And then looking to longer term and your recruitment planning, I think it's going to need more lead-in time, probably more thought about budgeting as well for things like visa costs. But it is all manageable with some forethought and planning. Good. So we will wrap up there. We've had one last question in before we end from Natalie, and the question is, if you have indefinite leave to remain in the UK, but not British citizenship, you must still apply for EU settled status via the settlement scheme. Yes, that's absolutely right. So if you have indefinite leave to remain or PR, permanent residence, but you're not converting that to British citizenship, then it is an absolute requirement to convert that to settled status through the EU settlement scheme. I know it feels frustrating to have to do that because you've already, or the person that has PR has already been through a long, drawn-out process to get it, probably over several months, but it does need to be converted into that online settled status if that person doesn't go on to get citizenship first. Good. Well, we will end our session there. Thank you very much for joining with us. Please do fill in the survey form at the end, and we will take into account your comments, which will really be appreciated. But otherwise, thank you for joining us today, and we will see you again soon at our next webinar. Thank you very much.